Hi and welcome to this DCP web tutorial. In today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to set up particle collisions in Blender 3. Okay, let's go ahead and open up Blender 3. So I've downloaded the latest version. If you're not sure how to install Blender 3, I'll put a link to that in the YouTube description. So this is the default splash screen and we're going to go ahead and click on General here, General. So we've got our general scene here. Let's just go and save our work as we go along. It's always wise to save our work. I'm just going to go into here and we're just going to call it particles-01. Let's save our work. So I'm going to turn on screencast keys. I've already made a tutorial recently showing you how to install screencast keys. So if you want to know how to install that, you can go watch that video and it will explain how to do that. But today we want to focus on particle collisions, right? So how do we create particle systems and how do we have them collide against other objects? So let's go ahead and click on this cube and delete it. So we'll select it and hit the delete key to delete that. I'm going to press Shift and A and I want to insert a circle. So we've got a circle here and it's already selected. So I want to go into the edit mode and then we want to go to the face and we want to click fill. So now the object has been filled, so it's got a face. So now we can emit particles from this face. So let's go ahead and click on that object and go over to the particle system and we'll click the plus sign and let's just click the play button and we can see particles being emitted, but actually being emitted from the top and they're falling through the object. So what we really want to do is let's just zoom out here a little bit. We're going to click on this object, go to its properties and just rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees and we can see that it's now rotated around. But do we really want to rotate it? Let's see, the x and y should be this way. So let's set that back to 0 and we'll rotate it on the y 90 degrees will be better. Now we can see the particles are being emitted from this face, this side, right, this side here, and they're flowing out in this direction. So not being emitted from the back of the face, only from the front. So that's quite important to understand. But if you had an object with multiple sides, like a cube, then it will be emitted from all sides from the object. But we're using a circle like this because we can control where the particles are emitted from a single face. So really actually want to rotate this 180 degrees because I want the particles to be flowing downwards, right? So they're going to be dropping down like this. I'm going to press the letter 0. In fact, what we'll do, let's just see. Let's just press 0 is going to be our camera view, right? So we want to let's just pause this video for a second. Let's just pause this and let's see. So what we want to do is get our camera facing this object, right? So let's zoom out a little bit. Here's the camera, but we're going to press Control Alt and 0. That moves our camera to this position now. So you can see the camera is no longer over here, it's facing this object over here. And we want to go to the camera properties. So let's go ahead and click on our camera up here and let's set the X position to 0. Let's set the Y position also to 0 and let's set our let's bring the Y position back. Actually, let's bring it back so we're looking further back, and then the Z we can set that to 0. So now we can kind of see it face on. The X rotation, let's set that to 0. The Y, let's set that to 0, and then the Z, let's set that to 0. So let's just see where our camera is facing downwards now, right? So we want to rotate it really upwards, or rotate it so that it's facing this object. So we want to rotate it on the x-axis. So the x-axis, let's just rotate it around this way to minus 180. Minus, let's do minus 180. Or maybe, sorry, minus 90. Is that right? Let's see. Minus 90. That's still facing the wrong way. So it would be 90. 90. Yeah, 90. Now it's facing this direction. So if we press 0 on our keyboard, now the camera is looking directly at this object. That's kind of what we want because we're going to play around with particle simulations and stuff, right? And we might rotate this slightly afterwards as well. But for now, let's go ahead and click on the move tool, click on this circle, and let's grab it and drag it so that it sits above the camera. And we want to now, let's see, we want to create a floor. So let's just middle mouse click out and let's just move across here. Here's our 3D cursor. So let's click on the 3D cursor, or let's just click around here and let's press Shift and A and add a floor. So we'll add a plane and let's press S to scale it and let's scale up that plane so it's much bigger. Now we can press 0 on our keyboard again and we really want to rotate this camera so we can see the floor a little bit because right now it's like very straight and we can't really see the floor. So let's go ahead and rotate this camera. Let's see, let's rotate it downwards a little bit, and on the z-axis let's move it up. So as we start to move up the camera, now we can see the floor, right? So really we want the floor to cover, I'm going to move the camera up a little bit, like sort of these sort of settings. They have to be exactly these, but we just want to see the floor here. We've got our particle simulation here, and we just want to click on the floor and make it a bit bigger. So let's click on the floor, press S to scale, and scale it up so that it goes past the camera viewport here. Now we can go ahead and click on the particle simulation, or this circle. Let's call it particle emitter, right? It's called particle emitter, so let's call it a particle emitter. Let's press play, and all of a sudden our particles just randomly go straight through the floor. We don't really want that, right? We don't want them flowing through the floor like this. Let's just click on our move tool, and what I'm going to do is go into edit, go into preferences, and inside navigation I'm going to tick orbit around selection here, orbit around selection. That way when we click on an object, we will rotate around that object. This just makes life a lot easier. That's a good setting to have, put it that way. So we want the particles to collide against this floor. So let's click on the floor. Let's press 0 so we go back into our camera view, and then we can go to the plane. Let's actually name it floor. Let's spell that correctly. Floor. So we'll click on it, and we'll go to our, let's see, our settings here. These are the they haven't labeled these things. So these are particles. This is our, what did they call this again? Let's have a look. Can't remember what this tab is called, but it's not that important. You click on this tab here, and we want to set it to collision. So now the particles will collide against the floor. We can see them colliding against the floor. So that's how we set up basic collisions, but obviously this simulation isn't so great. So let's make it a bit better. What we can do is let's first of all let's see, let's just stop this simulation for a second, and let's just check that our collision is working a bit better. So what we can do is just rotate this object. So let's rotate it on the x-axis. So we'll press R to rotate, then X. In fact, let's do R to rotate Y, and let's rotate it at this sort of angle. So it's nice, the particles are going off in a bit of a direction now. So now you can see them bouncing in this sort of shape, right? We can improve this, obviously. So we're just going to press Control Z to undo that, and let's click on the particle simulation, and let's create a particle for it. In fact, we'll create something called a collection. So let's create a collection quickly. So let's press Shift A, and we'll create first of all a UV sphere. So that will be our particle. Let's press G to grab it and move it over here, and let's click on it. And really we need better lighting in here as well, so we'll sort out the lighting in a moment, but let's just go to viewport shading here, and let's just go to file and save. Let's just save our work. We've got our sphere here. Let's call this particle 1. Let's call it particle 1 because we're going to create a few particles. Let's click it, go to the material, add a new material, and let's set it to an emission shader, and we'll give it a strength of like 5. So this now has a strength of 5, and it's an emission shader, but we don't really see that because we need to turn on bloom. Now you can see the emission. We turn on ambient inclusion and screen space reflections, and we'll go back to our material, and let's see, let's just bring down the strength a little bit so it will glow a little bit. We can adjust that later. Let's click on this object, press Shift and D, and then hit enter. That will duplicate it. We can grab our move tool and drag it to the side, and when we click on this, we want to click on this number 2 here. This allows us to create a new material, a separate material, so we can adjust the color of that one separately away from the original one. I'm just going to hold down the Shift key, middle mouse click across, click on this object, press Shift and D, hit enter, and let's grab that one and drag it across, and we'll make it like a blue color or something. So you can see how it's changing both of them blue. So I'm going to press Control Z, click this object, then click on this number 2. That will create a third material. So really we've got 3 different materials in here, and now we can change that independently, right? So we might make it like a, want to make it a blue, didn't I? Let's make it blue like this. So we've got these three objects, or these three particles. Let's label them particle 1, particle 2, and particle 3. Normally I would name the material the same. I'm being lazy, ain't I? So let's click on particle 1, double click, copy this particle 1 text, and label the material particle 1. This is the right way to do it. Label that particle 2. We'll double click on 3 and then name the particle. So the object is called particle 1, 2, 3, and now the materials that belong to it are called 1, 2, and 3. This is like the default material for the floor, so we'll sort that out later. Let's hold down the shift key and select these objects. In fact, what we want to do is click on this collection, right click on it, and we want to create a new collection, new one, and this new collection will be called particles, and we can select this one, hold down the shift key and select all three of these and drag them into the particles collection. So now they almost sit in like a folder here. You can see they're in a folder. So let's go to our simulator, our particle emitter. Let's click on that, and then we can go down to render and select halos and then select collection here, and then we can pick random. We'll do a click here and then we'll select particles. Let's click the play button. Now we've got these colored particles flowing from our particle simulation. Let's click on the floor. Let's give it a material. Let's call, in fact, let's undo that. I've just given it a particle system. So let's click here and get rid of it. We'll click on the floor, go to the material, give it a new material, and we'll call it floor for now. And let's just make that material a bit darker, and then we want to turn up the metallic and bring down the roughness. Let's bring down the roughness down to something like about here, right, something like this, and now we can see the reflections for our particle simulation here. And we've still got the collision working, so let's just click it. We can see the collision working, but we want to improve this a little bit. So we've got a basic system up and running. Really, these three objects, let's hold down the shift key and select them. You can see they're shining down here, so we want to grab them and move them away from the camera view. We don't really want to see them inside of our camera view. So if we zoom in here, we can see the camera, what the camera sees. So we've got a basic particle simulation up and running, but let's tweak this a little bit and improve it, and let's play around with the particle collision as well. Okay, at present we're using some default lighting inside Blender, so we can see if we click on this option here, Viewport Shading, click on the little drop down, click on this little box here, and these are like the default HDRI maps that you can click on to see your environment in different lighting. But we want to create or add our own HDRI map, because you can't render out. When you press F12 to render, this is what you're going to see. It's not going to look very good, so we want to try and improve that. Let's just move along the simulation to around here. If we render, this is what we're seeing right at present, right? So we want to improve this. So let's just save our work. Press Ctrl S to save it. Let's open up the web browser, and we're going to go to HDRI Haven. HDRI Haven. It's called Polyhaven now. We'll click on here. I'll put a link to that in the YouTube description. So let's just make a little note as we go along, because I'll forget. So let's open up this folder, and let's just make some little notes in here for you, so you can download the same HDRI maps that I use, or you can experiment and use other ones, right? I have to use the exact same ones. So let's see. Let's just drag this to the side a little bit. If we scroll down, we can click on HDRI Maps, and there's always a default one that I go for, which is nighttime. You guys have probably watched quite a few of my tutorials, and we use what is the Shanghai one? This one here. So I'm going to middle mouse click on this one, middle mouse click, so it opens in a new tab, and we'll just select a few other ones as well. Just middle mouse click them, and yeah, I've just got 3 here, right? So what's important is that you select HDRI here, and you can select 4K should be fine, and click download, and then do the same for the fireplace one. Click download, and then we'll do the same for this one here and click download. So let's make a little folder in here. I like to keep our work clean, so we just type in HDRI, and we'll drag these maps into here, and I'm going to put links to all of these ones I've downloaded into the YouTube description, so you can go ahead download these ones and download some other ones as well, so you can experiment with them. Yeah, don't do exactly what I've done. Try and experiment and see what other ones are available and what you can do with them. So we want to go over to our, let's see, we want to go over to our shading. Let's click shading here, and let's go over to the world settings, and here we can see the background and our world output as well. So let's click the background, let's drag it across a little bit, let's press shift and A, and we want to add a mix shader here, mix shader, and then we'll press shift and A and add another background. We're going to connect it to the shader here like this, and then we want to add an environmental texture, so let that go to here. We can connect that to the color here, and then let's press shift and A, and we want to add a vector mapping, and then press shift and A, input texture coordinates, and then press shift and A, and we want a light path here. You connect the generated to the vector here, and then the vector to the vector here, and then we're going to connect the is camera array all the way over to the factor here in the mix shader like this. We can create volumetric lighting maybe, but for now let's just click open, and we'll go to HDRI. I'm going to click on the Shanghai one. You can select any of these, and we'll click, in fact let's select fireplace and click open. We'll not really see anything happening here because we're still in the viewport shading. So let's go over to the render shading here, render. Now you can see the map being applied. You can see the gold color because our HDRI map is the fireplace, which had that gold accent to it. If we press 0, we can kind of see what the camera sees now. Right, so this is what the camera is seeing, but we don't really want this background to be white. So I do believe we can click in here and drag it all the way down to make it black, right? So now we've got a black background with our particles, and we've got this gold surface. And if we were to click on the open folder and click Shanghai or this other one, this one had sort of like this blue sort of tones to it, and then this one here, the Shanghai one, had a few different variations of color. And you can click on the rotation here. So if we rotate on the Z axis, would be sensible, because that would be like that vertical axis, right? So we can click rotate here. We can rotate around our HDRI map and get to something that we prefer. Something like this looks pretty good, right? Let's go back to our layout. We're still in the viewport, so let's go to the shading here. Now we can see what the actual camera will be seeing, and if we press F12, now we can see a better color, we can see our reflections and stuff like that, and everything's looking a little bit better. But we still want to play around with the collision, right? The collision here. So what would be nice is if we had some sort of text or some sort of content, and these particles dropped down and they collided with the text in some way. So let's go ahead and press Shift A, and we're going to insert a text object. Text, where is text? Text is here. So here's some text. Let's press number 7 will be our top orthographic. So we're looking at it from the top now, and really our circle is kind of overlapping our text, so we can just hide the particle emitter at the moment. Where is it? Particle emitter. Let's just hide it in the viewport by clicking here. So now we can see our text a bit clearer. This light source, we don't need it anymore. So this light here, we can actually just click on it and delete it. We don't need that. So we've got the text here. Let's click it and then go and press the tab key. Let's see. Let's do that again. I think maybe. In fact, let's click on the text itself. We should be able to press tab to go into edit mode. Yep, and delete this, and then we can just type in, let's type in particles, something like this, particles, and this is the default text. I'm going to leave the default text. I don't really mind this text being there. I'm going to press tab to come out of the object mode. So basically when we're pressing tab, we're going into edit mode so we can edit the text, and press tab to go back into object mode. But let's go over to the settings for the text here. This other thing, let's see, it's telling me what they were now. So physics properties. Before I wasn't too sure what this tab was called. It's called physics properties. So let's go over to the object settings, click on the text itself, and we want to rotate this. So let's go to our camera view. Let's press 0 so we can see the text here, and on the font here, in fact on the let's see, the character size, where is it, word spacing, let's just have a look here. Yeah, in font here we can change its size, right? So we want to make it much bigger, around, I'm setting it to like 2.5, around this sort of size. And then in geometry, in fact we want to rotate this first, right? So the text is already selected, let's press R to rotate X and type in 90. So now our particle text sits like this, and then we want to center it out. So the size is pretty good, but we want to center it. So let's go down to here, left, and let's set it to center. So now it's centered, but really it will be, ideally we want our registration point or our rotation point to be in the center. So let's set the top to center, but now the text kind of sits inside. So you just want to grab this blue handle, so click on your move tool, click on this little blue handle and drag. Let's drag the text itself, let's click it, and let's drag the text up so it sits just above the floor, just above it, right? You can see the reflection, all that good stuff. But now we can see our text is very, very thin, so we want to click back on the text object here and then extrude it. Let's make it thicker, so now our particles will come down and hit the text, they'll be able to hit it. Now we want to add a little beveled edge on this, so let's zoom in here and we'll go to I think it's offset, right? Is it offset? Let me just double check. No, it's not offset. Let's see. I think it's yeah. This is the bevel, right? So the bevel, let's set it to, but you can see these texts is sitting very, very close here. So we don't want that, these R's and these letters. Let's press 0 again to see the camera view, and let's go to the character spacing and let's increase the spacing a little bit so the text doesn't sit like overlap. We don't really want that to be overlapping. We've got a beveled edge here so we can catch some light and just improves the whole scene in general. Let's press 0, so we'll go back into our camera view, and then let's left click outside. Let's click on our selection tool and we can click outside, and let's just press F12 to render, and we can see our particle text written there. But it would be nice if it was a different color, right? So I think what we'll do for now is click on the particle text. Right now it's actually a text object, so we can press tab and we can add more characters to it, and we can press tab to go back into our object view. But we want to convert this into a mesh based object so that we can bounce the particles off of it. Right now that won't work, so you can't go into the physics. I don't believe you can. Yeah, you can't go into the physics and turn it into a collision object because it's not a mesh based object at the moment. So we need to go to object, go to convert, and convert it to a mesh. When you convert it to a mesh, you can't edit the text anymore, you can't change the characters, so be careful when you do that. It's kind of like a, something that you'll do and then not be able to undo it. But I'm going to press Ctrl Z just to undo that. Yep, so it's still text, but what we can do is go to save and then file, save as, and save it as a version 2, and then we can save it as version 3 as well. So version 3 will be after we convert it to a mesh based object. So we can always go back to version 2 and edit it if we wanted to. Let's go back to object, go back to convert into a mesh, and then we'll set it to collision as well. And if we click play, in theory our particle emitter is actually hidden at the moment, right? If we click play, the particles should be colliding. Let's just go back, let's just go file, save it, and click play. Now you can see the particles are bouncing off of the particle text, right? Some of them will just go straight through, but you can see they're bouncing. Some of them are bouncing behind. So what would be nice, or what would be wise, is let's press number 7. That takes us into the top view. Let's pause this. Let's just go back here. Let's click on our sphere and let's go into its settings, and its scale on the, let's see, its scale on the Y, we want to reduce it. Let's squash it almost, right? So we're making it more of a shape like this, so then the particles won't bounce behind or bounce in front, they'll bounce directly on the object. and then let's scale it. Let's scale it on the x-axis. Let's scale it across so that it kind of covers the width of this text, not all the way, but you know, a fair amount. We can even just move it slightly. Let's just move it slightly so that we've got an like an even gap on each side. So now when our particles drop, they should drop and fill most of the width of the particle text, and now they'll bounce off of it, right? So there's quite a lot of particles in here, so it's hard to see what's going on. So what we can do is click on the object. Let's go to the particle emitter here, click on it. Let's go to its settings, and right now it's set to 1000. Let's set it to something like 200, and we should see things a bit more clearly now. Now we've got less particles, and we can see them bouncing off of the particle text as well. This particle text doesn't look the best, so let's go ahead and click on it. And what we'll do is press number 7. That takes us into the top orthographic. Let's press Shift and D to duplicate it, hit enter, and we're going to drag it back. So we've got 2 copies of the particle text now, and this one we want to squash it a bit, so we go to the settings for this text. Let's call this text, let's call it text 01 front, and let's call the other one, the one that sits behind, text 02 back. Right, so we've got one at the front, one at the back. The back one, we want to squash it a bit, so we want to scale it on the y-axis, the green line, which is the y here, and we're going to scale it. We should be able to scale it. Maybe I'm scaling it wrong here. Let's have a look. Let's go inside here. We should be able to scale it. Right, we're scaling it wrong here. No, so we want to scale it on the z-axis. We want to make it quite thin like this. That we can drag it in, get it close to the other text, but leave a gap behind it. We'll leave this little gap here. So we can now click on text 2 and go to material, create a new material. Let's just double click this name, paste it in here. Let's press 0, and then we want to go to our emission. Let's increase the emission. Let's set it to something quite high, but we want to change its color. Let's change it to maybe like a pink, maybe a red sort of color. Let's press F12 and render. We've kind of got this glow edge around the edge. Let's press escape and let's increase the strength. But let's also go to our viewport, go to bloom, and let's see. Let's increase, just play around with these settings, right? The intensity, I want to kind of have it glow more. But let's go back to our text object. Let's see if we can increase this to get more of a glow. Now you've got the sort of the glow around the edge. If we press F12, we can kind of see this glow around the edge. Maybe this color isn't quite right, so I think a blue color will be better. Like a blue color. I think that will look better because we've got blue particles in our system. That looks much better now, right? Now you've got this nice glowing sort of edge. And then the text itself that sits in front, let's double click to copy the name. Let's create a new material for that one. Paste in the name. The reason why we're pasting these names because now we can see what all these materials are called in here. It just helps us later. And I want to make this quite dark, right? So I'm going to leave it white, but I'm just going to darken it down to something like this, quite a dark color, not quite black, but like a grey. And then I want to increase the metallic and then bring down the roughness to something like this here. We press F12. Now we can see our text here looking pretty nice, right? We can experiment. Now you've got to go and experiment with some of the settings. So go over to the render settings, and inside of the ambient inclusion, you can play around with these settings just to experiment and see what they do. It's really important that you experiment with the settings. And once you start experimenting with them, you'll learn. It's worth getting quite close to this text to see what's going on. And if you turn off or turn on the ambient inclusion, you can see what effect it's having, right? It's quite subtle, but you can see like the drop shadow underneath the text here, and the lighting changes slightly. So go and experiment with it. You can play around with the distances and do certain things in here to play around with it. Unless you do that, you're not really going to learn. So I just play around with the settings, see what looks good. If you like it, great. If you don't, you can always change it. Then you've got the screen space refractions here. Half traces, rubbish. So let's turn that off. And you can play around with the trace precision. So you can see how it's affecting the reflection here. Right, so you can just play around with this trace position. You can see it's quite blurry now. That might be the look that you're looking for, right? You can see it's quite blurry now in the bottom here, but as you increase or decrease, you can see the effect that it's having on your render. So play around with them and try and get it to what you like, something that looks good. You can just play around with the settings. That's all I do, is just have a little play and see what looks good, what's working and what doesn't work. And yeah, that's how you learn. I believe inside here shadows, soft shadows is set up already, so that should be fine. Okay, so I'll leave you to go and play around with those settings and just play around with it and get it to look something nice. And you always check it from the camera view, because that's the view that you're going to be rendering from. So you really want to check it from the camera view when you're playing around with these settings to see what looks good. Alright, play around with it. Okay, I'll leave you to experiment with that. With the particles up here, I'm going to click on the simulation and go back to the particle settings. There's quite a few things that we can do in here. So first thing, the wisest thing is to remove the emitter, because if the emitter is ever shown in the render, we don't really want that. We don't really want the particles or this sphere, this circle shape up here. We don't really want that to be in our render. If we were to pan like in upwards direction with our camera view, we don't really want to see that. In here we can, let's just click play. In fact, we want to go back to here and click play, and we can randomize the scale of the particles. That's one thing that we should do. Maybe we set them, in fact 0.05 was pretty good, but now we've got random size particles, right, and they're bouncing off of this object like this. And the other thing we can do is with the particle collision, we can actually add force fields to the simulation to manipulate the particles as well. So what we could do is press Shift and A and add a force field, and we add a vortex in here. So we've got this vortex. Let's just center that out. Let's just bring it towards the middle of this letter I, and this is called vortex here, which is fine. And we'll go to its physics settings, and if we set this to something like maybe 10 strength, and we click play, now we can see the particles are moving in this spiral, but this vortex is pretty strong, so let's bring it right down to something like maybe 0.25. let's see. So now you can see the particles are getting pulled into this center point here, but you can also animate the vortex and move it around to change how these particles flow as well. So you've got to experiment, right? Let's just try and set it to a minus value. Let's just see. Maybe we'll just reduce that down. So about 1.2. Now the particles are almost getting pulled into this vortex in the middle. So that's kind of optional. But what we might do is click on the emitter, and let's just go to its properties and scale it more on the Y. So now the particles are coming in from the side here. Can you see? They're flowing in off of the camera view. So that might look a little bit better, that they're now flowing off the camera view. Now you can just go crazy and go to the particle settings and set it to a stupid number like 5,000. And then if you turn off the overlays, click here to turn off overlays, then you can see things a bit more clearly in the viewport. what's going on. But that's a bit too much, right? So let's set it to something like 500. And sometimes you have to wait for the animation to loop back around to see it correctly, right? So just take note of that as well. So the particles only last 50 frames, but our simulation is 250 frames. So if we were to set our particles to like 150, and then set the end simulation to 100, then our particles will last a little bit longer, and we can see them bouncing around and doing their thing a bit more clearly, right? And there's a bit more time, and now you can see the actual the movement of the particles as they're flowing in this vortex. Now you can really see the vortex working here. You can see that right there. You can see that, right? Let's just go to the physics, and inside physics you can add some browning, and browning will add some sort of randomization to the particle trajectory. So if we were to set this to something like let's set it to something quite high, maybe around 4, then we'll get a bit more randomization in the movement of these particles as well. That's something nice to do. Down here inside of the let's see, viewport, where is it? Field weights. Here's the gravity. So we can reduce the gravity. Let's just set it all the way down to nothing. So now you can see there's no real gravity, right? So the particles are just moving in the kind of trajectory from the top up here. So you can see the simulation like this. This might be a nice way to make some sort of galaxy or star field, right? Quite a creative way to do that. But it would be nice if the particle, what you could do in fact is grab the emitter. Let's just zoom out. Let's just grab it. Let's turn back on our overlays, and let's pause this a second. We have to pause it and drag this down to around here, this sort of point. Then we can see the particles bouncing off of the text, but also rotating around it, almost like a little planet thing going on with the particles around it. So let's turn off our overlays again. We can see that here. So if we were to press F12 to render, then we can see the particles in the simulation like this. That's quite a nice effect actually. I quite like that. We could have, in theory, what we could have done is just emitted particles around here and around here, and then we wouldn't have had any particles in the center. But I think it looks okay as well, like this. Because we turn off the gravity, the particles won't basically drop to the surface, but if we were to turn up gravity, they'll kind of rotate around on the floor below it. So it depends on what effect that you want, right? So if we go back to the text itself and click on the physics, inside the physics you've got the collision here. So you need to go and experiment with some of these other options like field absorption, all of these different, like the stickiness. So you can, particles can basically how they interact with the actual object itself. So when they're colliding with the object, how do they interact with it based on these settings here. So you can like kill particles. If they hit an object, you can just kill them off. So you can see some of them are hitting this letter S and they're just dying away. So as soon as that particle touches this object or any of these objects, as long as they're touching one of the objects, whether it's the floor, because that's what actually the floor separated away, right, the collision for it. But you can go and experiment with these settings here. I just like to just click on them, drag them, see what they do, yeah, and play around with them, right? So let's just go back and click play. I think that looks pretty cool. So we learned quite a lot, really. It's not just particle collisions. We built a particle. There's no point in just showing particle collisions. We might as well just make something quite interesting out of the project itself. Let's press F12 and render it. And now you can see what it looks like. And now you can go and create your camera and create your animation and move around these particles. You can fly through the letters and do all sorts of other stuff. I'm sure you've learned that from some of my other tutorials as well. So that's really all I'm going to cover in particle collisions. You need to go and experiment with these other options. You've got like friction. Normally in Blender, you know, they've kind of changed a few things in here, but normally you used to be able to hover over the settings and it will give you a little explanation of these settings. So now I guess we've got to go and look in the manual and just read up on them to learn a bit more about them and just experiment with them that way. But that's okay, you know, if you've got to read the manual, you've got to read the manual. That's all you've got to do. So if you check out the Blender manual and then go to the collision section, so maybe we'll check that out quickly. Let's have a quick look. Let's go to Blender, collision, and then we should be able to see inside the manual if it's up to date. So like permeability, the fraction of the particles passing through the mesh, stickiness, how much particles stick to the object, right? So you can see a lot of the settings that are down here. You can read about them here, like dampening the duration of a collision independent of the velocity of the particle, randomize, random variation of damping, the friction, all of these options in here. You can actually read about them. In fact, I'll copy this link so that you can read more about these settings in here inside the Blender manual. At least you've got a simulation set up so that you can go and experiment. Sometimes it's nice to actually click on the particle emitter, go to the settings and set it to a very low number like 50, and then you'll be able to clearly see what's going on with the particle simulation. Especially when you're changing the settings, you'll be able to see a bit more clearly what's going on. And you might want to just do a couple of random small amount of particles. This looks quite nice as well, but you can see some of the options that we've applied in here. So let me go ahead and save this work. Let's pause this and drag it back. I won't render this out, or maybe I'll render it out and put it into the video tutorial as well, but I think that's enough for today's tutorial. We actually create some quite nice text here in as well. One other thing, if you don't want to see the emitter inside of the viewport, you can actually hide it by going into the particle settings, and underneath render you'll see viewport somewhere here, viewport settings, and you can hide the emitter from here as well, so you don't actually see the emitter inside of your viewport. So when you're playing it, all you'll see is like the particles, almost like what you would see when you press F12 and you render. You'll see kind of a similar logic to the render itself, right? Okay, that's just another little tip for you. Let's save this. Let's go ahead and close down Blender. That's a little tutorial explaining some of the features of the particle collision system inside Blender. We did a lot more than that. We set up a HDRI map. We created a floor and some text, and we converted the text to a mesh, and we applied a lot of materials to a lot of different objects. We even created a collection to group our particles together and apply that to the particle simulation, and then we applied the collision and played around with some of the settings to make the animation a little bit more interesting. So that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you find it useful. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you can access over 750 free video tutorials on a diverse range of software subjects, and I look forward to seeing you in the next DCP web tutorial.